A Harvard professor mocked Caroline Levitt in front of a packed auditorium, but minutes later, the 27-year-old White House press secretary turned the tables with a stunning comeback. "You won't believe what just happened." Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The Harvard auditorium erupted in applause as Professor Christopher Brown stepped up to the podium, his eyes brimming with defiance. He was renowned for his sharp-witted orations, where faith, particularly Christianity, was often held up for ridicule. But today, facing him was not some naive student, but Caroline Levitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, seated in the middle of the audience. She smiled quietly, ready for the intellectual battle awaiting her. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Amid the crowded auditorium, Caroline Levitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, sat calmly as the guest speaker, there to share insights on media and politics, though whispers circulated that her presence was owed solely to her ties with the president. At the podium, Professor Christopher Brown adjusted his glasses, the corner of his mouth curling with intent. "Let's get straight to the point," he began, his gaze sweeping over Caroline. "Research shows that intelligent people are less likely to believe in fanciful notions." He paused for a beat, then smirked sardonically. "But perhaps sometimes family traditions make it hard for people to embrace intellectual growth naturally." He tapped the microphone lightly, the small echo cutting through the murmurs in the Harvard hall. "Today," he started, his voice low and dramatic, "we're here to celebrate reason, science, and truth. The things that have dragged humanity out of the darkness of superstition." He paused, glancing briefly at Caroline, his eyes glinting with provocation. But sadly, not everyone keeps up with that progress. He raised his hand, and the large screen behind him lit up with a crisp graph, a downward curve illustrating an inverse relationship between IQ and religious belief. "Look at this," Professor Christopher said, pointing at the chart with triumph. "As intelligence and education rise, belief in supernatural tales, like some sky gods sitting on clouds. Astonishing, isn't it?" He scanned the room, his tone condescending. "Or should I simplify it further for those who need it, say those who still think God wrote the U.S. Constitution?" A smirk flickered across his face. Chuckles rippled through the audience. A few students clapped, while others glanced at Caroline, awaiting her reaction. She sat still, arms crossed, her expression unflinching. "I'm genuinely surprised," he said, pacing the stage like an actor in his element. "We have some of America's brightest minds here, the future of science, politics, thought. And yet some still cling to these primitive beliefs." He stopped, turning to face Caroline, his gaze piercing. "Miss Levitt, aren't you the mouthpiece for this so-called Make America Great Again? I suppose your faith is part of that plan of fairy tales to lull the masses, right?" Laughter echoed through the hall. A journalist in the front row scribbled furiously, sensing a headline in the making. Christopher raised a hand to quiet the crowd, then pressed on, his tone growing sharper. "Let me quote Richard Dawkins," he said, his voice thick with authority. "Religion is a delusion, a virus of the mind. And you, Miss Levitt, seem the perfect host. A conservative, a believer, a puppet of the president in an age of reason." He crossed his arms, his mocking smile widening. "So tell us, what do you have to justify this so-called faith of yours? Or are you just here to parrot empty White House slogans?" A few students fidgeted, sensing Christopher had gone too far. In the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, a longtime colleague, watched with concern. He knew Christopher loved to provoke, but this personal edge might lead to a misstep. Professor Christopher returned to the podium, casting one more glance at Caroline Levitt, his eyes daring her to falter or freeze. But instead of shrinking, Caroline stood. The faint scrape of her chair against the wooden floor rang out in the silent hall, drawing every eye. She stepped onto the stage. "Professor Christopher," Caroline began, her voice clear, calm, yet sharp as a blade, "I'd be delighted to address your question, and your assumptions." She paused, locking eyes with Christopher, a faint smile crossing her lips. "You pride yourself on scientific thinking, but it's ironic that you start with a bias, that belief in God equals a lack of intelligence. That's not objective reasoning, Professor. It's just prejudice, dressed up as rationality." The room fell silent. Christopher raised an eyebrow, his smile briefly stiffening, but he quickly crossed his arms, clinging to his confidence. Caroline didn't give him a chance to interrupt. "If you truly valued science," she continued, her voice steady but cutting, "you'd know this. Some of history's greatest minds, Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Albert Einstein, acknowledged a higher power in the universe. Newton wrote more about God than physics. Einstein said science without religion is lame. Were they fools, Professor? Or are you just cherry-picking evidence to fit your narrative?" A few students nodded in agreement while others turned to Christopher, waiting for his response. "You're dragging out dusty old names to justify yourself, Miss Levit," he scoffed, his voice pitching higher than usual. "They lived in the Dark Ages, before modern science enlightened us." "Dark Ages?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her tone. "What about Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project, a Christian? Is he outdated too, or do you simply dismiss anything that doesn't fit your preconceptions?" She stepped forward, her gaze sharp, her voice weighted. "You call yourself a man of reason, but instead of seeking truth, you start with a conclusion and work backward to justify it. That's not how science works." Professor Christopher gripped the podium's edge, his fingers tapping out a nervous rhythm. "Oh, you think you can outsmart me, Miss Levit?" he snapped, his tone biting. "This isn't a White House press briefing." A few laughs rose from the crowd. "No," she said firmly, "this is a place where reason and truth are honored. But you're turning it into a stage for mockery, not debate." She turned to the audience, her eyes sweeping across their faces. "I'm not here to preach, but to ask. If faith is truly a sign of weakness, why has Professor Christopher spent his career attacking it?" She turned back, a smile flickering. "Or perhaps you're the one afraid of something, Professor?" Christopher opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. A wave of murmurs swept the room, and for the first time, he looked shaken. His eyes wavered, his hands clenched the podium, and he stood frozen in a brief but heavy moment. The Harvard auditorium fell silent. Professor Christopher stood behind the podium, his fingers still gripping its edge, his gaze flickering between surprise and anger. The forced smile on his lips now looked like a mask about to crack. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Miss Levit," he said, his pitch slightly higher, as if grasping for control, "do you think tossing out a few names from history is enough to justify outdated beliefs? We live in an age of science, of evolution, quantum physics, artificial intelligence. Your faith has no place in the modern world." Caroline stood firm on the stage, microphone in hand, her eyes never leaving Christopher. She smiled faintly. "Professor," she replied, "you just mentioned modern science, so let me ask you this. If you truly believe in reason and evidence, why commit a basic statistical error in your argument?" She turned to the large screen, pointing at the graph Christopher had displayed. "You say high IQ means less belief in God, but Professor, correlation doesn't equal causation. Even a freshman would spot that. In all your years of research, did you overlook this fundamental principle?" Christopher flushed, his hands tightening on the podium. "Don't try to play clever with me," he snapped, his voice trembling with restraint. "This graph is an opinion. It's based on dozens of real data studies, not your feelings or blind faith. Science has proven that as humans advance, they shed superstitions like Christianity." Caroline tilted her head, her gaze cutting like a knife. "Real data, you say?" she asked, a touch of humor in her tone. "Then why not mention studies showing religious belief often correlates with higher mental resilience, stronger communities, and better mental health? Or do you only pick data that supports your story and ignore the rest?" She stepped forward, her voice ringing out decisively. "That's not science, Professor. That's propaganda." The audience erupted, a group of students in the corner cheering while journalists in the front row scribbled furiously. Christopher raised a hand for silence, but his face was now flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. "You're twisting the issue," he nearly shouted, his voice slipping from control. "Things like resilience or community don't prove God exists. They're just byproducts of human psychology, chemical reactions in the brain, nothing more. Love, justice, morality, all just evolutionary mechanisms to serve humanity. You can't use them to justify an imaginary sky god." Caroline stood still, letting Christopher's words hang in the air, then spoke, calm but razor sharp. "If justice is just a chemical reaction in the brain, then why do you still believe in it, Professor?" Her eyes bore into him. "If everything's just biology, Why do you fight for fairness in academia? Why get angry when challenged if it's all just reflexes? This debate is meaningless, and you know it." She turned to the audience, her voice rising like a wake-up call. Justice, love, meaning. They're not mere chemical reactions. They're the foundations that shape human society. Faith doesn't oppose reason. It opens doors to truths beyond the limits of pure science. The applause grew louder, a few students standing while Christopher stepped back, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "You're off topic," he growled, trying to regain the upper hand. "We're talking science, not empty philosophical platitudes. Quantum physics proves the universe runs without any God's hand. Evolution explains life's origins without needing Adam and Eve myths. So, what's your counter-argument, Miss Levit?" She took a deep breath, her eyes alight with the resolve of someone who'd faced public firestorms working for the president, criticism that had only strengthened her. Coraline looked straight at Christopher, her voice calm but commanding. "Quantum physics, you say?" She raised an eyebrow. "You're right, it shows the universe is stranger than we thought, but perhaps you know physicists like John Polkinghorne, a Christian, used it to explore deeper truths." She paused, then pressed on, her tone sharpening. "And evolution. It explains mechanisms, not origins. So tell me, where did life begin? A random chemical reaction? If you believe that without final proof, aren't you also putting faith in something unproven?" Professor Christopher started to reply, but Caroline didn't let him. She stepped forward, her voice cutting like a blade. "Let me ask you this, Professor," she said, her eyes piercing her opponent. "Where does consciousness come from? Not emotions or reflexes, but the ability to think, reflect, question, like this very debate. Science still can't explain it. So how do you? Or are you just good at mocking without answers?" Christopher's face flushed red, sweat dotting his brow. "Consciousness, it's a product of the brain, of billions of years of evolution," he stammered, his voice strained. "We don't fully understand it yet, but we will. And without God," his tone pitched high, almost self-soothing rather than rebutting. Caroline tilted her head, her smile no longer patient but sharp as a dagger. "Not fully understood, you say?" She echoed, a hint of mockery in her tone. "So you admit science has gaps, questions without answers. Yet instead of considering something beyond our grasp, you rush to insist there's nothing. That's not reason, Professor. That's prejudice in a lab coat." The applause thundered through the hall, no longer scattered but unified, powerful. A group of students leapt up, cheering excitedly, while others exchanged knowing glances before turning to Christopher, their former admiration giving way to doubt. He raised a hand, trying to signal silence, but it trembled visibly. You're twisting my argument," he shouted. "Science doesn't need gaps to shove God into. We've moved past that era. You're just a backward conservative clinging to delusions to prop up your political power." Caroline didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice ringing like an undeniable proclamation. "I'm not here to defend power," she said, her eyes ablaze with conviction. "I'm here to defend the truth. You say science has surpassed faith, but you forget faith inspired history's greatest minds. You mock me as a conservative, but you're the one clinging to the delusion that you have all the answers. Even when you can't address humanity's biggest question." Christopher gripped the podium, his trembling hands impossible to hide. His face, once red with anger, now paled. Caroline's final words, "You don't have an answer to the biggest questions," hung in the air like a sharp blade, slicing through the veneer of authority he'd once worn. The room stilled, all eyes shifting between the two figures on stage, a professor, once a symbol of intellectual arrogance, and a young woman standing unshakable, her eyes burning with faith and unyielding reason. Christopher cleared his throat, trying to reclaim his poise. You're trying to distract," he stuttered, raising a hand as if to ward off the pressure. "Science has given us answers. Not all, but enough to know no God is needed to explain the universe." He pointed at Caroline, but the gesture was feeble, lacking force. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward slowly, each movement underscoring the weight of her words. When she spoke, her voice was clear, calm, but honed like a finely sharpened blade. "Enough to know, Professor?" she repeated, a flicker of irony in her tone. "Then give me, and this audience, A proper answer. Where does consciousness come from? Not chemical reactions, not just brain impulses, but the ability to perceive, think, question, like this debate. Can your science explain it fully? Let me ask you one more question, Caroline continued. Where did life begin? Not evolution. That's just a process, not an origin. Did it come from a random chemical reaction in some primordial ocean? Do you have solid evidence for that hypothesis, or do you simply accept it because you don't want to consider another possibility? She paused, letting the question hang in the air. And, if there's no evidence, isn't your belief in spontaneous life just another form of faith? Christopher opened his mouth to respond, but this time no words came. He looked down at the podium, his trembling hands gripping the wooden edge, then slowly raised his head, his eyes wavering between confusion and disarray. That's a question yet to be answered, he stammered, his voice stripped of its former certainty. But sooner or later, science will find out. We don't need to rely on fairy tales. Caroline smiled, no longer gently. Yet to be answered, she echoed, her tone firm. Then let me ask you one final question, Professor. This universe, with all its physical constants perfectly tuned for life to exist, where did it come from? If just one number were slightly off, we wouldn't be here. How do you explain that fine-tuning? Random chance? The odds of that happening by accident are lower than finding a single grain of sand on all of Earth. So do you choose to believe in randomness, or do you have another explanation? The auditorium fell deathly silent. Christopher stood motionless, his hands dropping from the podium, his gaze blank as if confronting a truth he dared not accept. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Sweat rolled down his face, and for the first time in his career he looked not like a learned scholar, but a man cornered. Caroline took another step forward, her voice ringing out sharp as a verdict. You can't answer, Professor, she said, her eyes locked on him. And do you know why? Because you don't just mock faith, you fear it. You fear that the gaps in science aren't just unanswered questions, but signs of something beyond human understanding. You fear that a lifetime spent denying might rest on a flawed belief. Her gaze softened, but retained its resolve. I don't deny science, she declared. On the contrary, I cherish it, because science lets us explore the beauty and wonder of the universe. But when you claim there's nothing beyond the material, that's not a conclusion based on evidence, it's an assumption rooted in bias. You can't prove God doesn't exist, because science can't definitively prove a negative. So where does your certainty come from, Professor? Reason, or the very arrogance you accuse the faithful of having? And here's the last thing I'll say, Caroline went on, her voice resounding. Faith doesn't oppose intellect. It's its companion. When science reaches its limits, faith keeps asking questions. When data runs dry, faith seeks meaning. You mock it, but you can't answer the questions it raises. So who's really afraid here, Professor? Christopher stood frozen, his hands limp, his eyes glazed. The auditorium erupted in applause and cheers. Not just in support, but as if they'd witnessed an irreversible moment. Dozens of students leapt to their feet, their gazes fixed on Caroline Levit with unmasked admiration. Christopher stepped back, no longer the proud man who'd strode onto the stage, but a figure reeling amid unanswerable questions. He cleared his throat, grasping at the last threads of control, but his voice emerged weak and halting. We should move on, he muttered, his trembling hand rising as if to silence the crowd. Today's topic isn't... His voice trailed off into the void, unheard by all. No one cared. Every eye was on Caroline, still standing firm on the stage, microphone in hand, calm yet resolute. She didn't nod triumphantly or smirk mockingly. She simply stood, letting the truth speak for itself. In the back row, Professor Henry Wallace, Christopher's longtime colleague, rose slowly, his face a mix of concern and resignation. He hurried down the aisle, his voice cutting through the audience's buzz. Perhaps we should return to the main agenda, he said, trying to steer the debate back to its original course. There's still much to discuss today. He glanced at Christopher, his look both comforting and urging, but Christopher didn't respond. He just stood there, hands shaking as he adjusted his glasses, his eyes vacant, as if the events had drained every belief he'd clung to. The audience no longer noticed Christopher. The applause faded, giving way to animated chatter. "She just took down Christopher," a student whispered to a friend, eyes alight with excitement. "No one's ever done that." In a corner, a group swapped fervent remarks, voices thick with awe. He couldn't answer, not a single thing. Up front, a journalist scribbled furiously, pen racing across the page, eyes gleaming at the prospect of a blockbuster headline. Amid the crowd, a student raised a camera, lens trained on Caroline, capturing a moment everyone knew would echo for years. Caroline stepped off the stage. As she returned to her seat, a few nearby students leaned toward her, whispering praise. "You were amazing," one said, voice trembling with thrill. Caroline smiled faintly, nodding thanks, but said nothing more. She didn't need to. The room had spoken for her. Christopher, now a shadow of himself, watched Caroline with a dazed stare. He turned to the big screen where his once proud graph still glowed, now a mockery. He cleared his throat again, attempting to resume his lecture. As I was saying," he began, voice quavering, "science shows—" But no one listened. The audience's murmurs drowned him out, and for the first time in his career, Christopher felt utter helplessness. He knew he'd lost, not just to Caroline, but to the room that once revered him. Professor Christopher lingered behind the podium, but no one paid him heed. He quietly gathered his papers, hands shaking, eyes avoiding the audience, now a buzz about Caroline Levit. His lecture stumbled on awkwardly, his voice faltering and disjointed, but no students took notes. Instead, they whispered among themselves, eyes bright with excitement. "She just did what no one dared," one said, voice full of wonder. "Christopher was always unbeatable, until today." Caroline, back in her seat, was no longer an anonymous guest speaker under suspicion. When the conference paused, a cluster of students swarmed her, voices eager and curious. "Where'd you learn to debate like that?" one asked, thrilled. "How'd you stay so calm when he attacked you?" another chimed in. Caroline just smiled lightly, replying simply, "I just said what I believe is true." But her humility didn't dim her magnetism. A student raised a phone, recording a brief interview, while a nearby journalist tapped out a frantic message to their editor. "White House press sec takes down Harvard pro..." Huge headline incoming. Words spread fast. Within minutes, audience-recorded clips flooded social media. An ex-post read, "Caroline Levit just silenced Professor Christopher. Watch now," with a video of her questioning consciousness and life's origins. Views skyrocketed, comments exploding. "She's unreal. Christopher got crushed. Debate of the year." In the dim corner of the now quiet hall, Christopher sat alone, hands cradling his head. The conference ended, but the debate's echo lingered in his mind. On the table, his once prized notes and documents lay scattered, meaningless relics of a battle lost. The screen before him was dark, but Caroline's questions still rang in his head. Where does consciousness come from? How did life begin? He thought he had all the answers, but now for the first time in years he felt small before the unknown. Outside, Caroline left the hall, a few students trailing her, thanking her for speaking up. She nodded, her gaze gentle yet firm. She didn't know this story wouldn't end here. It would spread, inspire, and challenge old biases. As Caroline Levit stepped out of the Harvard Hall, the afternoon sun softly bathed her face, reflecting the calm she'd maintained throughout the debate. The crowd of students had dispersed, but the clash's resonance lingered in the air. She walked slowly through the ancient stone corridor, then paused upon seeing a familiar figure. Professor Christopher stood alone, clutching a messy stack of papers. No longer the proud man who'd ascended the podium, he looked like someone grappling with his own doubts. Hearing her footsteps, he looked up. His eyes met hers, not with defiance, but with a deep pensiveness. After a moment's silence, he spoke softly, his voice tinged with fatigue yet a hint of honesty. "You know, Miss Levit, in my entire career, no one's made me rethink like you did today." Caroline regarded him, her gaze steady yet kind. She didn't smile or gloat, simply replying, her voice calm but profound. "Sometimes, Professor, those who try hardest to destroy faith end up strengthening it most." She nodded lightly, a farewell gesture, then turned away. Her steps were steady, blending into the fading afternoon light. Christopher watched her go, his hand tightening slightly on his papers, his mind heavy with unfamiliar thoughts. The story didn't end there. The debate video swept across social media, from X to YouTube, racking up millions of views in hours. Comments flooded in. Caroline Levit is a legend. Christopher met his match. But beyond a personal victory, it became a symbol of something greater. Faith and intellect aren't enemies, but allies in the quest for truth. Caroline didn't just defeat Christopher, she challenged prejudice, sparking a dialogue thousands joined. Christopher sat quietly in the dark corner of the empty hall, alone with the scattered notes before him. The room, once alive with cheering and debate, now held only silence, a silence more daunting than any applause or murmur. A deep sigh escaped his chest, as if the ordeal had sapped his every ounce of energy. His trembling hand reached out, touching the papers now rendered meaningless. The graphs, equations, scientific citations, all he'd once seen as unshakable bedrock, no longer offered the certainty they once did. He recalled Caroline's every question, her razor-sharp rebuttal, and that steady, unyielding gaze. He'd expected a dreamer, a blind zealot incapable of reason, but instead faced an opponent not just smart, but poised and piercing. Consciousness, life, the universe's fine-tuning, he muttered, as if grasping for anything to restore his faith in himself. But for the first time, the arguments he'd trusted implicitly failed to convince even him. The answers he'd confidently repeated throughout his career now sounded hollow. He didn't reject science, he devoted his life to it, but perhaps he'd made a mistake assuming science was the whole truth. He leaned back, eyes closing, recalling his youthful days. He'd once been a passionate student, eager to explore the world, thrilled by every unanswered question. But then he'd been swept into the academic race, where reputation, prestige, and recognition outranked truth. He'd learned to scoff at what couldn't be proven experimentally, to view faith as weakness, a crutch for those too timid to face the universe's randomness. Maybe, he whispered, as if afraid his own thoughts might betray him, maybe the close-minded ones aren't the believers, but those who mock them. The idea made him shudder. It contradicted everything he'd held dear, yet he couldn't deny he'd refused to question, dismissed anything clashing with his worldview. Caroline hadn't proven God's existence. She didn't need to. She'd only ask questions he couldn't answer, questions he'd never truly dared face. Could I be wrong? He laughed bitterly. It was a simple question, but for someone like him, to admit that possibility was no small feat. His career rested on materialism, pure reason. If he was wrong, what of all he'd taught, written, fought for? But if he stubbornly clung to his old stance, was he truly honest with himself? He'd look at his hands, once steady as he lectured hundreds, signed research papers, debated dissenters. Now they trembled, not from defeat, but from a different fear, facing his own arrogance. He remembered past debates where he'd crushed opponents with cold logic, but this time he felt no victory, he felt empty, because truth wasn't just what experiments could measure or equations prove. Perhaps it lay in what science couldn't yet touch. He realized changing his view didn't mean betraying science, it meant being truer to himself. He didn't need to instantly believe in God, but he could admit he didn't know everything, and more importantly, he could start listening instead of mocking. He took a deep breath and stood, stepping from the dark corner. He saw light streaming through the hall's glass doors. For the first time in years, he didn't feel compelled to cling to a rigid stance. He felt relief, because now he was ready to ask questions. And perhaps that was the real beginning of knowledge. Personally, I think Caroline Levit's stand shows how faith and reason don't have to clash, they can sharpen each other. Her calm dismantling of Christopher's arrogance reminds us that dismissing belief isn't intellect, it's just bias with a fancy title. I admire how she didn't just defend her views but expose the limits of his certainty, something we could all learn from in today's polarized world. That said, I get why some might side with Christopher. Science has unraveled so much, and faith can feel like a leap. But isn't assuming we've got it all figured out a leap too? What do you think? Does faith hold us back, or does it push us to ask bigger questions? Thanks for watching this epic clash of ideas. Drop your thoughts below, hit like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Let's keep the conversation going.